Okay, we are now ready for assembly, but before we start putting our pieces together, we need to establish a very important rule about gluing. Surface area equals strength. For example, a rabbet joint is created for the purpose of increasing surface area. If you glue the end of the board just to that surface, it's going to be a lot weaker than putting it in that rabbet. Now you have surface area on the end and the edge. However, if you never apply glue to this edge, you've taken away the strength of this joint. It's also critical that you either clamp these two together to create a tight joint, or you metal fasten. For assembly today, we're going to be using the stapler. Really, I'd prefer to be using my brad nailer, but currently it's not working. And even more than that, I prefer just to use clamps when I can, because both the stapler and the brad nailer are going to leave visual defects that I don't always like to see. But in this case, there's no reason to wait for the dry time to take them out of the clamps, so we're just going to use the stapler today. First joint we'll assemble is a dado joint. So we're going to apply glue again for strength. We need all surface areas to be covered in glue. So we're going to work to achieve that. It takes a little bit longer, but it's worth it. Try and get some glue on the edge of your finger, push it up against the side walls. Once you have that, make sure you put this horizontal piece in correctly. So the 45 is facing you and the dado is down. And try and center it side to side. This is a pretty snug fit, so I'm pushing it down. Make sure it's tight everywhere. And then we can staple it in. Next joint is a rabbet joint. So I'm going to cover all surfaces here. Again, in a joint like this, I'd normally probably use clamps, but for these example joints and to save time, we're just going to hold them in place tight. So I'm going to make sure I'm holding it tight this way. The staples will hold them down, but if it's not tight right here, we're going to have gaps in our joint. And everything's tight and flush. And staple. For the biscuit and miter joint, getting glue on all surfaces is going to be very important. But it's also important that we work quickly so we have time to work this joint together. Lining up the 45-degree angle is sometimes a challenge. We're going to get glue in each slot as well as on the surfaces. Again, there's a lot of potential for surface area with a biscuit joint, but if you don't cover those areas, then it doesn't do any good. For that reason, we coat the biscuit separate, because it is difficult to get inside those slots. So we're going to completely cover this biscuit in glue. And biscuit also expands when it gets wet from the glue, so it helps to hold the joint even better. Now normally with miter joints you have one in each corner, so it's much easier to clamp. In this case we only have one. So I'm going to hold it here for a little bit while the glue begins to set up. And then we're actually going to use a very simple trick of tape. Now again, I normally wouldn't recommend this for a miter joint, but in this case it's an awkward joint, and I think it's what's going to work best. So the stronger the tape, the better. So we're going to use packaging tape, and when we put this together, we're going to make sure we pull it as tight as we can. We're going to line up the joint, pull tight, wrap it around the corner. Clean off some excess glue. Push it down. And as I push it, wrap the tape, seal it up good. That should be a nice miter joint. Just like the biscuit joint, the dowel joint is critical that we cover the dowels, but we also need to make sure that the lines that we drew to line these up are both on top. We don't want to flip this because that's not going to line up well. So make sure your lines line up. We're going to put a little glue in each hole as well as on the surface. Here, be careful not to go too wide. We'll let the glue on the other surface control the width of the piece. And then we're going to coat these dowels. Obviously, if you were doing a lot of dowels, you'd get a little dish with a brush, and that would be helpful. And there's lots of different techniques to try and get glue on the surface of dowels. Lines line up. Have some squeeze out. Now we're going to use this clamp to clamp it temporarily and get as tight as we can. And because we want to continue working, we'll use a tape trick again. Again, if extra strength was important, we just leave the clamp on, but right now we're looking at efficiency with time. So while that's clamped, we're going to tape that surface, as well as the other, just to hold it while we continue on to the next joint. To glue on the head with the butt joint, we didn't have to do any preparation for this joint. It is critical that we get plenty of glue on here. Glue on both surfaces. Again, here we don't know the exact width, so be cautious. We don't want a lot of glue everywhere. I'm going to center it, keep it flush. Get a clamp on it, and then we'll use tape again. Or you could just let it set in the clamp. In assembling the pocket hole joint, the most important thing is going to be keeping this surface flush. we're also going to line up this top edge with that line. To help keep things flush, we're going to use this clamp. Then we'll drive the screws. First though, we're going to apply some glue. Use a little less glue so it doesn't ooze all over on this one. Line it up with the line. Clamp it together, flip it so we can drive the screws. Pop that off of there. The last joint to assemble is what could be a panel and a groove. In this case, it's a little hand waving at you. But we'll place some glue in that groove. Also, I'm going to apply some glue to the plywood. So that is one example of how groove joints are used, are in panel doors. So we got plenty of glue here. Place that in there. Just put a little tape to hold it in place. Just wait for that to dry. After you remove the tape from the joints, to make sure you know the name of each joint, you need to clearly and neatly label each one. Lastly, don't forget to put your name on the back. This makes the wood joint man happy.